Welcome back, students. Today we're going to talk about suffrage and voter turnout. Suffrage is a fancy word that means the right to vote. If you have suffrage, you have the right to vote. You can actually show up on election day and cast a vote for an elected leader in your country and in your government. Let's talk about how the right to vote has expanded in the United States over the years. If you go back to the early days of our country, voting rights were very restricted because you had to be a certain kind of person in order to legally vote. Voters in those early days had to be white, they had to be men, they had to be 21 years old or older, and they had to be a citizen of the state. So if you lived in a territory or a district controlled by the United States, you didn't get to vote. There were also fewer offices that those voters voted for than there are today. A typical voter in the early days of our history would have only voted for their state-level leaders, people like their governor or their state legislatures. They would have voted for a member of the House of Representatives to go to the United States Congress. And they would have voted for electors in the presidential election, and these electors would then go on to vote for a president in the Electoral College. A lot of this has changed since then, and it's changed typically through the process of amending the Constitution to give greater voting rights to groups of people, to make voting in the country less restricted than it was when just white adult men were voting for this limited number of offices. Let's look at specifically how that all has changed. Here's the list of constitutional amendments that have expanded voting rights in our country. The first one to take effect was the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment ensured the right to vote regardless of race. This amendment was created shortly after the Civil War, and it was designed to protect the voting rights of African American men. And what it does is it makes it so that they cannot take into consideration your race while giving you the right to vote. What this effectively meant in real life was that you no longer had to just be white in order to vote. The next amendment was the 17th Amendment. This actually increased the number of people we got to elect. This created the popular election of U.S. senators. Prior to the 17th Amendment, our senators in the United States Congress were elected by state-level legislators. So as a citizen of the United States, no matter what state you lived in, you got only an indirect say in who your senators got to be. After the 17th Amendment, the election of U.S. senators became statewide elections where the people of the different states got to pick their senators directly. And this is what they mean by a popular election of United States senators. 19th Amendment is another amendment that gives a group of people the right to vote. In this case, it was the amendment that gave women the right to vote. So this effectively removes the requirement that you have to be male in order to vote. The 23rd Amendment expanded voting rights into the District of Columbia. Washington, D.C., people who lived there were not technically living in a state. They're living in a district. Prior to the 23rd Amendment, they did not have the right to vote in presidential elections. And this problem was corrected with that amendment that directly gives Washington, D.C. residents the right to vote for president. And the 26th Amendment is the last one so far, and this has had the effect of lowering the voting age from 21 years old to 18 years old. So if you think back to where we started from and consider all of these amendments that have expanded voting rights to this point, you can get sort of the full picture of what suffrage looks like in this country right now, where you don't have to be a certain race, you don't have to be a certain gender, you do still have to be 18 years old or older, but a lot of the restrictions that were in place in the early days are no longer in effect in keeping people from voting. Just because people can vote doesn't mean that they will vote. There's another term called voter turnout that describes the number of eligible voters that actually show up to vote on election day. There's a couple of important facts that you need to remember about voter turnout in the United States. And the first one is that even though we allow a lot of people the right to vote, not everybody exercises that right. The United States voter turnout is typically lower than you see in most other democratic countries. If you were to compare our voter turnout to a voter turnout of a country, say, in Europe that practices democracy, you're going to find that fewer Americans are showing up to vote in our elections than their citizens are showing up for theirs. And the other trend that's evident is that when United States voters do show up to vote, they're much more likely to vote in a presidential election than any other. A lot of people assume that presidential elections are the only elections that we have. And what this does is effectively ignore the state level elections, the congressional elections that happen in between those high profile, big deal presidential election years. And the effect that you have on the turnout is that if people do choose to vote, they vote for president but might ignore the other elections in between the presidential election years. Before we move on, take a couple of minutes and consider that last question on the front of your note sheet. Why do you think Americans are less likely to vote in state, local level elections? You can think about the different factors in how we do things, and tie some ideas together. Take a moment to jot down your thoughts, and then we'll move on. There are, of course, factors that affect voter turnout, how many people actually decide to show up on election day and vote. And there's some things out there that will actually increase voter turnout, and factors that also decrease it or convince fewer people to show up and vote. Here's a list of things that increase voter turnout. And they have to do with issues, candidates, competitiveness, the attitude of voters, and party loyalty. If these things are in play, chances are voter turnout is going to be higher. So let's look at them each individually. If the issues that the politicians are talking about affect many people, people are going to be motivated to go out and vote. If the candidates are appealing, in other words, they have things going for them that draw attention or draw support from voters, that's going to increase voter turnout, cause more people to show up and vote for them. Likewise, Americans are much more likely to vote if they feel like the race is competitive. If it's a tight race or no one really knows who's going to win, that's going to convince more people to show up and vote. A huge factor is really the attitude that voters have. If voters feel like they can have an effective impact on government or that their vote matters, that's going to increase voter turnout because more people will be convinced that their vote will count for something, and that's an important thing to do. In periods of our history where you have high levels of loyalty to a political party, people are solid Democrats, solid Republicans, or solid members of another party, that's also going to have an increasing effect on voter turnout. But if you flip these things around, the opposite can have an effect that decreases voter turnout. So if voters find issues, political issues, irrelevant, disconnected from their lives, boring, or too complicated to understand, this is going to cause a lot of people to not really bother about voting on election day. When candidates are unappealing or when the race is non-competitive, sometimes there's even political races out there with just one candidate on the ballot. That person has no competition. There's no real sense of importance getting out there to vote. So people aren't going to turn out to vote, and the voter turnout will be decreased. When voters don't care, this is the huge impact that pushes voter turnout down. When potential voters don't have any kind of motivation or they just don't care to get out and vote, they're not going to show up to vote, and our voter turnout is going to be lower. And likewise, when you see a lack of party loyalty, where people are fed up or tired of identifying with one party or another, they want to feel like they're more independent and removed from the party politics of the day. An effect that can have is pushing voter turnout down. So depending on what set of factors you have going on, an election can see increased or higher voter turnout with more people showing up to vote, or decreased lower voter turnout with fewer people showing up to vote. There's also some personal factors that affect an individual's choice whether or not to go out to vote, and also an individual's actual ability to get out there and vote on election day. And these have to do with the education level of that potential voter, the age of that potential voter, and the income of that potential voter. People who are more educated are more likely to vote. This is just a fact that's backed up with statistics. Also, people who are older are more likely to show up than younger people. Younger voters, people who are 18 years old or in their 20s or early 30s, are notorious for not showing up on election day and voting. And this is a trend that may be changing, but if you look back at the patterns over the last several decades, young people don't show up to vote as much as older people do. And there's also a factor that has to do with income. The more income or wealth a person possesses, the more likely they are to vote. Another important factor is what that voter believes. If they believe that they will have, their vote will have, an important impact on the outcome of an election, they will more likely turn out and vote. But if they believe that their vote doesn't matter, or if their vote doesn't count for anything, or that the system is rigged against them expressing their opinion or their belief, it's going to discourage people from actually turning out and voting. Speaking of historic trends in the number of people that turn out to vote, if you look back over the last several decades, a fairly long stretch of time, one thing that stands out is that voter turnout has been in decline. And this is kind of counterintuitive because as we've increased the number of eligible voters through expanding voting rights, you would expect maybe the numbers of people who show up to vote to increase as well, but that hasn't happened that way. However, in the last couple of presidential elections, particularly in 2008 and 2012, there's been some increase in the number of people that have showed up to vote. This may, of course, have to do with some of those factors that we talked about earlier that can increase voter turnout. Really relevant issues that affect a lot of people and appealing candidates that can draw support from lots of different groups of voters. These may be factors that are pushing up voter turnout in those presidential elections. As you wrap things up, think about the last two questions on your note sheet. How do you think voter turnout affects the way political candidates shape their campaigns? In other words, how do politicians use what we know about who typically shows up to vote to shape their efforts in winning support in a given election year? The second question is, how do you think voter turnout affects the way government leaders address issues that affect the United States? In other words, is there a connection between who shows up to vote and which issues get addressed and how when the government acts? Think about those questions. We'll talk about this stuff in class. Bring your questions. I will see you then.